as this list right here is about to show you, my friend, some properly important moments in the beloved Star Wars franchise surprisingly never actually found themselves soaring into theaters, or even your living rooms. Now sure, some of these happenings were realized in comic books, novels, and even video games in some cases. However, due to none of the following entries ever popping up on the big or small screen over the years, the vast majority of Star Wars lovers out there will have never seen some honestly quite massive deaths, showdowns, and other game-changing occurrences. So with all that in mind, I am Gareth, this is What Culture Star Wars, and here are 10 massive Star Wars moments you didn't even see. Number 10, the sterilization of Geonosis. While it definitely had something of a starring role in the middle chapter of the prequel trilogy, Geonosis and its bug-like inhabitants oddly disappeared by the time of the original trilogy. They still had a major part to play in the wake of the Clone Wars coming to an end though, with the Geonosians actually initially designing the superweapon that would become the Death Star, and eventually being forced to help build the terrifying space station for the Empire over their homeworld during the early days of the Galactic Empire. Things then took a turn for the worse for the species. Once the Death Star's hyperdrive was fully operational, the call was made by Grand Moff Wilhuff Tarkin to completely sterilize the desert planet via Imperial gas canisters. And that act right there almost resulted in the complete extinction of the species, with only a little click-clack and a queen egg surviving the massacre, as seen in the Rebels animated series. Though said queen would eventually hatch and actually be sterile. She'd go on to connect herself to a droid factory and produce her own battle droid offspring instead. Whatever works for you. However, that horrifying extermination of sorts has only ever been mentioned and discussed in shows and comic books, with viewers never actually seeing the shocking events that led to the Geonosians eventually being pretty much wiped out completely by the time of Episode 4 A New Hope. Number 9, the Battle of Jakku. Now, here's an event that was actually experienced by anyone who's ever fired up the campaign mode on Star Wars Battlefront 2. Now that is a good time right there. However, if you're not much of a gamer, there's a solid chance you've never witnessed the massive fight that served as the final showdown of the Galactic Civil War. First introduced on the big screen during Episode 7, The Force Awakens, the desert planet of Jakku was the site of the New Republic's last battle against the Galactic Empire. A year or so on from the Battle of Endor, AT-ATs, Star Destroyers, TIE Fighters, and Stormtroopers all fought against Admiral Akbar's fleet and the New Republic's troops on the ground. That all-important final chapter of the war, one that also saw the likes of Inferno Squad Commander Iden Versio and Captain Wedge Antilles fight their good fight, ultimately saw the Empire being defeated. And following on from that big ol' L, the Galactic Concordance was signed, an agreement which brought the fighting and Galactic Empire to an end. Well, for a bit anyway. The most those non-gamer Star Wars fans out there have seen of this huge piece of galactic history is that crashed Star Destroyer during the early moments of Episode 7 though. And while the battle was also explored during both Chuck Wendig's Aftermath Empire's End and Alexander Freed's Victory's Price novels, reading the events on the page still doesn't count as seeing them in all their explosive glory. And while on the subject of battles in Star Wars, I want to know right now, what is your favourite battle in Star Wars history? You throw it in that comment section down below. Number 8, how Vader was rescued after the destruction of the first Death Star. Remember the dramatic climax of Episode 4 A New Hope? How could you forget? Luke Skywalker using the Force to successfully blow up the Death Star. Han Solo proving he did have a heart by arriving late on to help his pal. Oh, and that latter moment also resulted in the farm boy turned Jedi's Pops being hilariously knocked into a spin as he rolled out of the film altogether. That was the last we saw of Darth Vader in this epic first Star Wars movie. But with the Sith Lord ultimately popping back up in Episode 5 The Empire Strikes Back on Hoth like none of that embarrassing TIE Fighter chaos had even happened, it begs the question, how was Vader able to escape his rotating fate? Well, though it wasn't ever shown on screen, it turns out that after being knocked into space by one of his escorts, no, not that kind, the former Anakin Skywalker eventually sent out a distress signal to the Devastator Star Destroyer. And following on from that, as covered in Claudio Gray's Lost Stars novel, a pair of Imperial pilots, Sienna Ree and Baris Sai, picked up Vader. As simple as the act itself may be, it's still a pretty important detail that explains precisely how the cyborg was able to reunite with the Empire after such a humiliating defeat. Number 7, Palpatine somehow returning. Speaking of Sith Lords returning to places, easily the most infamous re-emergence in the franchise's history occurred during Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. Technically though, said return doesn't actually go down on screen in that movie. While the opening crawl does indeed confirm that both the dead speak and Emperor Palpatine had seemingly cheated death, the chilling message he sent out into the galaxy isn't actually revealed in the sequel movie. Instead, that honor was reserved for Fortnite players. That's right, Sheev's creepy comeback actually first played out on that multiplayer video game. With his words of "At last the work of generations is complete, the great error is corrected, the day of victory is at hand, the day of revenge, the day of the Sith," being heard during a December 14, 2019 event as a way of promoting the incoming movie. So again, if you're the kind of person who only picks up a PlayStation controller to occasionally best your pal at FIFA, it's highly unlikely you ever even saw a moment that hugely impacted the events of that final disastrous Skywalker Saga movie. Ah, you lucky person. Number 6, the murdering of Darth Plagueis the Wise. Before he was using the likes of Darth Maul, Count Dooku, and Darth Vader to take over the galaxy, pulling the strings in the shadows throughout the Clone Wars, or cackling in the face of death, Sheev Palpatine was the apprentice of another Sith Lord, Darth Plagueis. If you know anything about Sith Lords, it's that there can typically be only two, which means that in order for Palps to rule alongside his own apprentice, he needed to deal with his master first. Palpatine would later somewhat indirectly explain how he went about doing this in Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, of course, telling Anakin Skywalker all about the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise. Though Palpatine would explain that he was powerful enough to use the Force to influence the midi-chlorians to create life, he wasn't strong enough to stop his apprentice from killing him in his sleep. Now, Plagueis' story and demise were explored in more detail during James Luceno's titular Legends novel, but this vital piece of Palpatine's backstory, a murder that allowed him to become a Sith Master in the first place, was an enormous moment only ever spoken about on screen. But you never know, maybe a Tales of Young-ish Palpatine Disney Plus prequel series will explore this intriguing part of Sith history in the future. I mean, weirder things have happened. Thank you very much for watching this video today, my friend, and if you're enjoying what you're watching, then hit that subscribe button down below for more What Culture Star Wars stuff in your day. Number 5, Maz Kanata getting the Skywalker lightsaber. Yeah, you just knew this one was going to pop up sooner or later. Easily the most infuriating unanswered question the sequel trilogy threw into the Star Wars universe. Maz Kanata's owning of the Skywalker lightsaber in Episode 7, The Force Awakens, came with a once fascinating tease. As she handed the weapon over to Finn and was asked by Han Solo how on earth she came to possess it, the Force-sensitive alien just threw a swift, "a good question for another time" back at our heroes. And that was that. Though it was shown in the Charles Soule Star Wars comic series that an Ugnaught worker on Cloud City eventually found the weapon in the wake of Luke having his hand chopped off by his dad, precisely how Maz got her hands on it wasn't just not shown on screen. It was never even explained, like, ever. Sure, the Rise of Skywalker Visual Dictionary at least notes that it was eventually salvaged from the industrial depths of Cloud City, but doesn't go into any detail when it comes to how it ended up in Maz's castle. And seen as though that moment eventually leads to the weapon finding its way to the likes of Finn and Rey in this latest trilogy, it's certainly a bit of a biggie, but one we still know hardly anything about. Number 4, a lot of Anakin Skywalker's training. The first 6 Skywalker Saga tales, the Star Wars The Clone Wars animated series, and even a fairly recent live-action show cover a lot of the rise, fall, and redemption of Anakin Skywalker. But not everything. Thanks to the big old time jump that occurs between episodes 1 and 2, an awful lot of little Annie's training largely goes down off-screen. Disney Plus's Obi-Wan Kenobi series did give fans a rather satisfying flashback to a time pre-Attack of the Clones, when Anakin and his master Obi-Wan Kenobi were engaging in some lightsaber practice. I mean, look at him go. But there are so many other key events in his training that were never given the screen treatment. There was that business on Cato Nemoidia, which may or may not count, mentioned in Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, where a now Jedi Knight Anakin felt he saved Obi-Wan's life. Like, that story was only covered in Mike Chen's Brotherhood novel in canon. The Charles Soule Obi-Wan and Anakin comic series also dives into the fascinating period between Episode 1 and 2, as a young Skywalker questions whether he actually wants to continue being a part of the Order, and Palpatine begins grooming the future Darth Vader. But none of those important and interesting events were ever thrown onto screens, with only fans of the Star Wars stories on the page being treated to these chapters of Anakin's story. Number 3, the dissolution of the Senate. While it was unquestionably an extremely important part of the prequels, the Galactic Senate doesn't make a single appearance in the original trilogy. As for what happened to the giant room full of floating senators from across the galaxy, who once gathered together to argue about various laws and changes that would affect the planet within it, that was actually explained away in a throwaway line during Episode 4 A New Hope. It was noted by Grand Moff Wilhuff Tarkin as he wandered into a meeting with Imperial officers that the Emperor had decided to dissolve a now Imperial Senate that had already lost a ton of its power. Following on from the end of the Clone Wars, regional governors ended up having more power than those who once fought for change in the Senate Rotunda. Watching Palpatine suddenly bring an end to the once powerful Senate, and the reaction of the senators themselves to the death of the final remnants of the Old Republic, would have definitely made for a compelling watch. But this was a huge moment for the galaxy far, far away that was just reduced to a line in a scene mostly remembered for Vader finding an officer's lack of faith disturbing. One thing is for certain though, you can bet there was no thunderous applause this time. Number 2, the Stormtrooper attack on the Lars family homestead. Now obviously viewers were left somewhat horrified by the results of a Stormtrooper attack on the Lars homestead during the events of Episode 4 A New Hope. But the savage attack itself has never really been depicted on screen. Now it's not hard to see why, of course. The visual of Aunt Beru and Uncle Owen smoking skeletons beside their incinerated home was already plenty disturbing for a family-friendly film. But many have still found themselves wondering precisely what went down during that deadly Stormtrooper raid. Did a brave Owen and Beru put up a fight during the interrogation? I mean, we've seen them do it before in the Obi-Wan Kenobi series. And is that what led to them being burned alive by some frustrated and desperate stormtroopers looking to get their hands on the stolen Death Star plans? Or did they just play ball and were still murdered by the ruthless Imperial soldiers? The actual events that led to their fiery deaths have never been fully shown on screen, and they likely never will now that the story has largely moved away from a Luke Skywalker whose life was utterly changed by this specific moment of savagery. It's probably for the best, to be honest. Number 1, the many Bothans dying to bring the rebels information. We know all about the brave figures who died getting the first Death Star's plans over to the rebels, with Jyn Erso, Cassian Andor, and the rest of the Rogue One crew all giving their lives on Scarif in their quest to bring down the Empire. But there's another group of courageous souls who were not given the full big screen spin-off treatment, after sacrificing themselves to get our heroes some valuable information. Those many Bothans who died to give the Rebel Alliance the location of the second Death Star, and news of the Emperor stopping by for a visit. Like a few of the other entries on this list, this absolutely vital Star Wars event actually wound up being depicted in a number of different places away from the movies or shows. The Shadows of the Empire Legends multimedia project, released in 1996, goes into a bit more detail when it comes to these brave spies, who are dog-like creatures in the extended universe, explaining that 24 Bothans died trying to get this massively important intel back to the rebels. Gamers were also able to play through these perilous moments in the likes of the Legends X-Wing Alliance and Rogue Squadron 2 Rogue Leader video games. However, when it comes to the current canon, this piece of Star Wars history hasn't been explored anywhere near as much, with the Bothans themselves not even being visually described at this point, which is just rude. In both Legends and canon though, this valiant sacrifice still remains a moment that has never graced a movie or television project. Yet. Do it!